What's going on, guys? I'm Pete, and welcome to Retro Game Attic. If you're an NES collector like me, you probably have stumbled across different variations of the same game along the way. Whether it be different colors, logo positioning, or just entirely different artwork, I always thought it was kind of interesting to see the different variations of game cartridges, which is why I compiled this NES Cartridge variant guide to hopefully help you on your collecting journey. A few things to keep in mind. This list is purely for cartridge aesthetics and label differences only. I'm not going over internal or chipset differences here. This list is for North America only, so no PAL or Japan games. This list is for game cartridges only. There are a ton of game box variations, but the cartridges are the most commonly found in the wild, so that's what I'm going with here. As far as the unofficial games, I'm only discussing the Tengen Games and the Color Dreams / Wisdom Tree games, since they're the most common. I'm going to split up these cartridge and label variations under a few different categories just to keep things a little organized. So with those out of the way, let's start with the easy to spot variants. Alright, so first up in our easy to spot variants, I have to get this one out of the way. It is the 3 versus the 5 screw cartridges. So earlier NES games had 5 screws holding the 2 halves of the cartridge shell together. The easiest way to spot these obviously is seeing the 3 screws versus the 5 on the back. There's also tabs on the top of the 3 screw cartridges that differentiate from the 5 screws. As you can see, the 5 screw cartridges do not have those tabs. Mostly the black box games came in the 5 screw variant, but a lot of early third-party games like Castlevania, Akari Warriors, Section Z, Ghosts and Goblins, etc. had those as well. They were phased out in favor of the 3-screw cartridges around like 1987 or so. And while we're on the subject of black box games, the next variant on the list is the white oval Nintendo seal versus the black round. So you can kind of see those two differentiations here. Here's the black round seal. This is an earlier release, and then this is the later standardized white oval seal of quality that we're all pretty familiar with today. It was incorporated into games around 1987. There are plenty of games such as Super Mario Brothers, Castlevania, Friday the 13th, Bubble Bobble. A lot of those early games have the round Nintendo seal, but then they were later released with that white oval seal. Not a huge difference between those two, but it is something to note. I personally prefer the look of that black round seal. I think it looks a lot cooler, even though that white seal is kind of what we're familiar with today. I don't know, there's just something a little more old school looking about that versus that white seal of quality. But that's just my personal opinion. Most people probably won't care about that at all. So moving down the list here, next up we have the Zelda Gold cartridge versus the later Gray cartridge release. So this is the initial release of Zelda. It came in that super sweet gold cartridge, and then later down the line it was re-released in a gray cartridge under the Classic series. And as you can see, the games are pretty similar looking. Both are the 3-screw variants. Their labels are pretty different. As you can see, the logo orientation is switched between the two of those, and the crest as well. The older release has that round Nintendo seal, then the newer one has that white oval seal of quality. Nintendo Entertainment System is embezzled on the top over here, and then on the newer cartridge, the Nintendo Entertainment System is down in that left-hand corner, that bottom left-hand corner. The cartridge coating is on the front of this gold cartridge, and the end labels are actually different too. I didn't notice that as well. So the Zelda typeface is much bigger on that later release. This one is probably the easiest variant to spot. I mean, gold cartridge versus gray. So since we're on the subject of The Legend of Zelda, I figured I'd mention Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. So this is my copy here, and there's actually 3 variants of this game. As you can see, this one is the gold variant, but it has the white oval logo. Now there is another gold cartridge variant. I have the box for it here, but it has that older Nintendo logo, the old round logo. But other than that, the cartridges should be exactly the same. Now there is one more. There is a gray cartridge. So the Adventure of Link logo on the gray cartridge is situated at the top, and then this little blurb here is actually removed from it. It has that newer style Nintendo Entertainment System logo in the bottom left-hand corner. It'll have that USA-1 coating on it in that bottom right-hand corner. But it has the white oval seal as well. And again, the gray cartridge of the Adventure of Link is the later release Classic series of NES games, so it pretty much has the same label layout as the re-release of The Legend of Zelda. So let's keep going with those easy to spot variants. Here are 2 variants of Super Mario Bros. 3. As you can see, the labels are pretty much identical, but the Brothers on the later release is different than the initial release. This one's kind of known as the Left Brothers, how it's oriented all the way to that bottom left. Everything looks pretty much the same on these, except for that Brothers orientation. They both have the same Nintendo seal of quality. This later release has the same coating as the original, except for it is USA-1, indicating that it is a later release. The end labels on both look pretty much the same rear labels, but this one is a little bit harder to spot. I don't really come across too many of those Left Brothers in the wild. It's mostly just that newer release right here. I'm always excited to see the Left release, because when you see them side by side, that Left Brothers orientation just looks so weird to me. It almost looks like a bootleg bootleg cartridge or something like that. So let's keep going with those easy to spot variants here. Here are two versions of Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. You know, to the untrained eye, they look pretty much identical. Same typeface, there's Mike Tyson, the ref, same Nintendo seals, and labels look pretty much the same. But the main difference here is that the bullet points on this later release on the right, you can see that they're colored in orange, and on the earlier release, they're white. And that is the only difference between these two front labels of the game. It's just that white coloring on those bullet points. That's the only difference. But then we flip them over to the back, and as you can see on the back labels, there are a little bit of differences here. You can see on the earlier release, there is no REVA like on the later release, and the Nintendo logo is oriented all the way to the right on this earlier release versus the later one. It's kind of centered in the middle. Other than those few small differences, that's really the only thing. Some people look out for these white bullet point cartridges. I honestly couldn't care less. I have two copies of these because I actually recently came across this one, but that is the difference between the two. Small, but still notable. So next up on our easy to spot variants, we have Blades of Steel. I have the older cartridge here on the left, and then the newer one is on the right. And it's pretty apparent that the difference between these two games is that red border surrounding the artwork on the newer game. They both have the white oval seal of quality. The older game does have that USA coating, and then the newer one has that USA-1 coating. But aside from that border around those labels, the logo, the artwork, and everything else on there looks pretty much identical. You can see on that newer cartridge with that red border, it also has that Konami Classic Series branding. And I believe both of these games actually do have the same exact end labels, so if you are thumbing through games at like a swap meet or a garage sale or something like that, and you're looking for the Classic Series release, make sure to pull that cartridge out and verify if it has that red border around the label. So this one should stick out like a sore thumb should you see it in the wild. Moving along a little bit further, I know I mentioned this before, but I figure I should point it out a little bit more. Here is Super Mario Bros. 3, the two variants. We have the Left Brothers, which is the older variant, and then the coating on the bottom is just the USA is what it ends in, and then later releases have that USA-1 coating. Now, a lot of first-party Nintendo games, like the black box games, do have this on later releases, but there are a lot of third-party games too, a lot of like Capcom, Konami, and other games like that. A lot of the times, that's really the only difference between these cartridges, but if you are on the hunt for variants, this is a pretty elusive one that a lot of people probably do overlook. It's just that -1 on a lot of later cartridge releases. So as we get more and more into the black box games, there are a good amount of variants here and there, but it gets a little bit more difficult. But an easy one to figure out here is I have two copies of Donkey Kong. We have the earlier release on the left and the later release on the right. And as you can see, the logos, everything looks pretty much the same. Same Nintendo seals, same end labels, and same rear labels. But the main difference you can see here is that there's a trademark after Nintendo Entertainment System on that later release. That's the only difference. So a lot of these earlier games, this was released before, I guess, Nintendo had the trademark on Nintendo Entertainment System, so there's no trademark on those earlier releases versus the newer releases. But as we get more and more into the black box games, these are two 5-screws. I showed Metroid before. There are the later releases of the 3-screws versus the 5-screws, and then the coating on a lot of these. Earlier release doesn't have like a coat or anything on the bottom, the later release does, and then there's also the round seal versus the oval seal. So there's a lot going on with the black box games. There are little subtle differences here and there, but I figured I'd mention it. I do think the most interesting out of all these black box variants is that trademark, though. It's kind of wild to me that these earlier ones have no trademark and then the later ones do. Again, a little subtle difference, but it is something to look out for if you're getting into these black box variants. So moving on to the next category, I'm going to lump all of these together as the Tengen Games. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, Tengen made a handful of unlicensed Nintendo games, but actually down the line, there were a handful of them that became officially licensed NES cartridges, so I'll go through the differences here. This category is going to be a little bit more rapid fire because they're super easy to spot. It's literally a black versus a gray cartridge. And then first up here, we have the Tengen release of Miss Pac-Man on the left, and then the officially licensed Namco release on the right. And each of these cartridges has its own unique artwork. So moving along here, we have the unofficial Tengen release of Pac-Man in the middle in that black cartridge, and then to the left we have the officially licensed Tengen version of Pac-Man. And then to the right we have the 1993 official Namco release. Now both of the unofficial and the official Tengen releases have the same label, but the Namco release has its own unique label. And then next up we have the Tengen release of Tetris on the left, and then the official Nintendo release of Tetris on the right. These ones have completely unique artwork. And then next up we have the Tengen Black Cartridge Gauntlet on the right, and then we have the official Tengen release on the left. Both of these releases do share the same artwork. And then finally, last up, we have the Tengen RBI Baseball on the left, and then the official Tengen RBI Baseball on the right. And both of these games do appear to share the same artwork. So moving right along here to the next category, I'm going to lump these ones together as well. These are the Color Dreams and Wisdom Tree unlicensed games. So the first variation to note here are the blue versus black cartridges. Now, a lot of these Color Dreams and Wisdom Tree games came in the weird baby blue color cartridges, but the more common variation of these ones here are the black cartridges. The games that do have the blue and black variants all have the same label artwork. It's literally just a difference of a blue or a black cartridge. So another pretty easy one to spot. And then next up we have a Color Dreams game here. It is Captain Comic. Now this one I believe only came in the baby blue cartridge color, but the main difference between these two is the orientation of the labels. There's the right side up label and then there's the upside down label. As you can see, the pictures aren't oriented incorrectly. A lot of these did come out with an upside down label. And next up here we have a Wisdom Tree game, King of Kings, the early years. Now these ones are just two totally different labels. So the one on the left here looks a little bit more cartoonish. It kind of has like a dude riding a camel, and then the one on the right here, I guess it's Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. A little more of a serious label. So two totally different ones to look out for. I mean, the main thing that jumps out to me is a yellow or a blue label on this. So moving right along here, we have Impossible Mission 2. Now these aren't Color Dreams or Wisdom Tree games. These are just more crappy unlicensed games, so this is why I lumped them into this category. On the left here, you can see the American Video Entertainment release with that pretty respectable artwork. And then on the right here, you have the SEI release of the same game, and it has that just plain Jane label, devoid of any artwork, but it does have its own unique cartridge shell. I had no idea about this variation until I did research for this video, so that was a pretty cool one to find out. And last up on our unlicensed games, we have RacerMate Challenge 2. So there's three variations of this cartridge. The first one on the left here is a black one that's kind of reminiscent of that Tengen cartridge shell, and this one is meant for the front loader NES. And then moving on to the two cartridges to the right, these ones are meant for the top loader NES. There's like little handles on both of them that you can kind of see protruding out. But the main difference between these two is that the one cartridge on the left has a label oriented correctly, and then the label on the right is oriented upside down. So first up on my list of complete label changes is the Metroid label change. As you can see, this earlier release is on the left, and then the later release is on the right, and these labels are completely different. The right one obviously looks a lot more modern, a bit more stylized. It has its own Metroid logo, versus the black box variant. It kind of has that classic look. So this newer Metroid game was released under the Classic series. This was the same series that the re-release of The Legend of Zelda and then the re-release of The Adventure of Link were under, but completely different labels, as you can see. Different end labels, different coloring. So I guess I can compare all three here. We have the 5-screw of the original, the 3-screw of the original, and then the re-release of that is only a 3-screw. And moving along under the label changes, this one is another super easy one to spot. We have Mike Tyson's Punch-Out versus the re-release of Punch-Out. So this is another Classic series game, as you can see. The labels are completely different. This is after Mike Tyson was dropped from the game. It's a variation of the original label, obviously without Mike Tyson. There are two different Nintendo seals. This one has the USA 1. And then as with other Classic series released games, you have that Nintendo Entertainment System in the bottom left-hand corner. As you can see also in that Metroid re-release right here, there are different end labels on both. And then as you can see on the back, the rear labels are different. That later release has a lot more warnings on the back of it versus the original release. Again, this one is a super easy one to point out. Some people may argue that these are different games. I'm going to count them as the same game, hence this is a label change in my opinion. Let's keep going. Next up on label changes, we have Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Now these are two totally different games. The one cartridge on the right is the Taito 1991 release, and the one on the left is a Ubisoft 1993 release. Both labels do look pretty similar. You can see that the Taito release on the right has like a zoomed in picture of Indiana Jones, whereas the Ubisoft one on the left is zoomed out. They both have the oval seal of quality. They're kind of subtle changes between the two, but really the biggest tell I think between the two are whether or not it has the Taito logo on the bottom or the Ubisoft logo on the bottom. Here we have Gunsmoke by Capcom. Both of these games have that early Capcom border that's kind of reminiscent of like that Vaporwave style, but the main difference between these two logos is that the cartridge on the left has the movie style poster logo, and the cartridge on the right has like more of a cartoonish style. The Gunsmoke logo is a little bit different between the two as well, but they both have the round Nintendo seal. Now these ones do look kind of similar. They both essentially have the same layout, but really the main difference is whether or not it has that movie style poster artwork or the cartoon artwork. Moving along, we have the Untouchables by Ocean. So as you can see, these cartridges are pretty different. The one cartridge on the right is known as the black label, and then the one on the left is known as the blue label. The black cartridge has that USA coding, and the blue cartridge has the USA-1 -1 coating. I do like the black cartridge artwork. It kind of reminds me of like the VHS cover for the movie. Here is Tecmo NBA Basketball. Now this one is a later release from 1992. Now both of these labels look pretty much the same, but there is one important difference. If you look closer at the NBA logo, the cartridge on the right doesn't have a white background behind it, and then the one on the left does have that white background. Alright, so next up on our label changes, we have the Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt combo cartridge. Now we have the older cartridge on the left here, and then the newer one is on the right. And right off the bat, you can see that the Nintendo Entertainment System is in the center of this old cartridge, and then on the newer cartridge, it's situated at the bottom of the label. And another thing to note on the older cartridge, there's actually no Nintendo seal on it, which I always found kind of interesting. The newer cartridge has that white oval seal. They're both 3-screw cartridges. They have the same rear labels. They do have the same code on the bottom as well, the NES MHUSA. Another thing to note too, on the Nintendo Entertainment System logo on the older cartridge, it's the older style versus that newer Entertainment System typeface on the newer cartridge. And then another thing to note here is that on the older cartridge, the duck artwork is actually cut off a little bit more in this older cartridge versus the newer one. You can see the entire duck on the newer one. I don't know offhand which one is more rare, but I actually prefer the look of the older cartridge. It just looks a little bit more old school in its design. But they do look pretty similar all in all. Next up is Bases Loaded by Jailco. Both games' artwork and logo look just about the same here. The cartridge on the left is the older one with that round seal of quality, and then the one on the right has the oval seal. But the biggest difference between those two is the Jailco logo at the top. The older cartridge on the left has that orange Jailco logo, whereas the cartridge on the right has a blue Jailco logo. Next up on label changes, we have Athletic World. Now there's a handful of differences between these two cartridges, so I'm just going to go right down the line. The left cartridge is older, and the newer cartridge is on the right. So starting on the left cartridge, you can see that Family Fun Fitness is there, and it's absent on the newer cartridge. And then right below the screenshot of the game, there's a little blurb about the Family Fun Fitness control mat in the older cartridge that's absent from the newer one. There's also a Series 1 logo on the older cartridge. The older cartridge has that round Nintendo seal, and in the copyright information below it, it does mention the Family Fun Fitness, which is absent from the newer cartridge. The older cartridge has that USA code, and then the newer cartridge has the USA-1 code. And one more thing to point out too, the older cartridge is a 5-screw variant, whereas the newer one is a 3-screw variant. You can see that those 3-screw tabs are absent from the older cartridge. Here we have Top Gun by Konami. Now both of these labels do look pretty similar. They both have the same logo, artwork, they both have the round Nintendo seal, the same USA coating, but the biggest difference being on the newer cartridge on the right, on the bottom of the label there, you can see a little bit of information about a Paramount Pictures copyright that is absent from the older cartridge on the left. And then another thing to mention too, the older cartridge on the left is a 5-screw, whereas the newer cartridge on the right is a 3-screw. And last up in our label changes is Wayne Gretzky Hockey. Now as you can see, there's a lot going on here, so I'm going to start with the top left. Wayne Gretzky has that black Kings jersey, and it has just a USA coating. Moving on to the right, Wayne Gretzky is still in that black Kings jersey, but it has a USA-1 coating. On the bottom left cartridge, you can see that Wayne Gretzky is now in a white Kings jersey, and it has USA-2 coating. And then finally in the bottom right-hand cartridge, Gretzky is still rocking that white jersey, but there is no Kings logo, and then the coding is USA-3. Now, to my knowledge, this is the only official NES game with 4 label variants. And then moving along, let's check out some rear label changes. Now, I mentioned this one before. The earlier game on the left has a pretty simple caution label, and then that later release has a lot more warnings on the back of it, and it is noted as REVA. Not super interesting, but it is another easy one to spot. And then next up on the rear label changes, we have the battery backup games. The earlier battery backup game on the left here has a few simple warnings, and it is a gold label as you can see. And then the later game on the right has a lot more warnings on the back of it, like the other newer release games that we saw before. Again, not super interesting, but I figured I'd point it out. And then another little subtle change here, we have more battery backup games. We have the gold Legend of Zelda on the left here, and then we have Final Fantasy on the right. The rear labels look pretty much identical, except for that larger Nintendo font and then 1985 trademark on Final Fantasy in that bottom right hand corner. And this is another subtle one as well, but I figured I'd mention it. So last up here, I have a little bonus. Now this one isn't so much of a label variant, but I figured I'd point it out anyway. So we have the earlier release on the left here, and then the later release on the right. We have Gargoyle's Quest 2 on the left, and then Wario's Woods on the right. Now these are obviously two totally different labels. I think a pretty important distinction with Wario's Woods is that it actually has an ESRB rating down here in the bottom left-hand corner. This is the only NES game to actually receive an ESRB rating. This game was the last officially licensed NES NES game in North America, released in 1994, and this was after the ESRB rating came into effect. I think it's a pretty cool little piece of trivia, and I think it makes the game look a lot more modern in my opinion. Like, aside from that bright and vibrant label, that ESRB rating really brings the NES game out of the 80s and like into the 90s. Like, this looks like a quintessential 90s game to me. So I thought it was pretty interesting. Again, not a label variant, but a pretty cool little piece of trivia. And that was my NES cartridge variation list. I used to collect doubles and try to get all the different variants, but at this point in my collecting, I just hold on to the oldest version of the game that I can find. I don't know why, I just kind of enjoy having the older version, or what I perceive to be the rarer version, which isn't always the case. Overall, I'm just happy with the game working and being in good condition. But some people are completionists and still want to get them all, and I totally get that too. I hope this video helps you all on your collecting journey, or just discovering more about the NES. So is there anything that I missed? Was there anything in this video that you didn't know about yet? Please be sure to let me know what you thought of this list in the comments. Thank you all so much for checking out Retro Game Attic. I really do appreciate you all. Have an awesome day, and I will see you on the next one.